Welcome back to Vietnam War Memoirs. Have you ever heard a story from the Vietnam War in which American troops unknowingly delivered explosives to their enemy, only to have those very explosives turned into deadly traps against them later? It may sound unbelievable, but for small Vietnamese commando units operating deep behind enemy lines, nothing was ever wasted. Weapons, ammunition, and even explosives abandoned or captured from the battlefield could become valuable resources in a desperate struggle where supplies were always scarce. In Part 6 of veteran Viet Cong Commandos' memoirs, you will hear how ingenuity, patience, and battlefield experience allowed a handful of soldiers to transform the enemy's own weapons into effective tools of resistance. Let's find out what happened. Before we begin today's story, I would like to mention that this video uses an AI-generated voice. As a Vietnamese storyteller, English is not my native language, and I want to ensure that these historical memoirs are presented as clearly as possible to viewers around the world. For that reason, I have chosen to use AI narration to help deliver the story with consistent pronunciation and clarity. My goal is not to replace the human element, but to make these first-hand accounts more accessible to an international audience while preserving the memories and experiences of those who lived through the war. Thank you for your understanding, your support, and your interest in these remarkable stories from history. Now let's begin. In September 1971, we infiltrated the wire defenses around the Cu Chi district headquarters on a reconnaissance mission. Even now, after so many years, whenever I think back on it, I still shudder. That night, Ta almost got all of us killed by a frog-shaped mine. We were lucky that Thao, crawling behind him, noticed the danger in time and grabbed Ta's flailing leg before it triggered the device. As the B-40 gunner, Ta carried a long launcher already loaded with a rocket, plus 4 additional rockets on his back. The load made his profile bulky and awkward. For that reason, I had assigned him to remain outside the wire and guard the breach point, but for some reason, he decided to crawl after me instead. Trying to keep up, he spread his legs wide and pushed off the ground, an extremely careless movement. If one foot had snagged the tangled concertina wire, the mines connected to the barrier would have detonated in a chain reaction. All of us would have been blown apart. For a commando, the key to getting through enemy wire was to make yourself as small and compact as possible. The smaller your profile, the easier it was to slip through narrow gaps without disturbing the obstacles. Yet Tai kept trying to crawl forward. Thao, who was directly behind me, spotted the problem. He hooked Tai's leg to stop him and signaled for him to turn back. To his credit, Tai obeyed immediately. But with the bulky B-40 launcher and rockets dragging behind him, he had no solid footing from which to push himself away. As he struggled to reverse direction, he nearly brushed against one of the wire strands. For a split second, disaster was only inches away. Inside the enemy's wire defenses, no one dared speak above a whisper. Only after you had made it safely back out could you truly know that you were still alive. That was why we often said, survive one mission and you earn one more day of life. It was not a slogan or a boast. It was simply the reality we lived with every time we crawled through the enemy's defenses. This ending works well because it preserves the reflective tone of a memoir while conveying the meaning of the original Vietnamese expression to an international audience. In early 1971, Logistics Unit 814 was reorganized and gradually restored to operational strength. However, it was not until the middle of the year that we were finally able to reestablish contact with them. From then on, supplies began reaching our unit again, although only in small amounts and at irregular intervals. Even so, compared with the hardships we had endured in 1970, the situation had improved considerably. After Nbe gathered us to brief the unit on the situation and issue the combat orders, none of us asked any further questions. We simply returned to our bunkers and instructed the men to make their preparations. By then, everyone understood what the orders meant. There was little need for discussion. The mission ahead would speak for itself. I do not know how other units were equipped, but our gear was fairly simple. Each man carried a small field pack containing a poncho, hammock, rain sheet, salt, basic bandages, and a packet of roasted rice reserved strictly for emergencies. Our demolition pouch held between 12 and 16 explosive charges, along with 20 guide markers and 50 safety pins used in mine clearing work. We carried 3 loaded magazines in our ammunition pouches, while 2 additional magazines were taped together and attached to the rifle for faster reloading. Inside the pack were another 100 loose rounds of ammunition. And of course, there was the entrenching shovel, a tool that never left our side and was as essential to survival as the rifle itself. The veterans carried little more than the equipment necessary to survive and fight. The new recruits, however, were different. Some still kept family photographs, letters from home, and pictures of their sweethearts tucked away among their belongings. Kin and Tai even carried personal diaries. We could not help but smile at that. The soldiers arriving in 1971 had it better in some ways. They could afford to bring personal keepsakes into the South without constantly fearing that such items might fall into enemy hands. For those of us who had been in the field for years, sentiment had long since given way to necessity. Most personal possessions had been discarded one by one, until only the bare essentials remained. To help the new recruits adapt to the realities of the battlefield, we took turns leading them on field familiarization patrols. They learned to navigate the red basalt soil, dense undergrowth, muddy ground, and the many obstacles that define the region. We introduced them to the different types of barbed wire defenses, some lined with sharp spikes, others fitted with razor-edged metal strips capable of cutting flesh with the slightest touch. Most importantly, they learned to recognize the various traps and mines the enemy concealed throughout the area. No amount of classroom instruction could replace experience in the field. The sooner they became familiar with the terrain and its dangers, the better their chances of survival. Whenever the opportunity arose, we taught the new men how to spot enemy soldiers before the enemy spotted them. That skill alone could mean the difference between life and death. We also showed them how to camouflage themselves properly. On a real battlefield, a few decorative streaks of paint across the face were useless. Effective camouflage meant covering exposed skin with mud and earth until you blended naturally into the terrain. For some of the young recruits, former students with fair complexions, that required a surprising amount of mud. Fortunately, none of them seemed bothered by getting dirty. They accepted it as just another part of learning how to survive in the field. In November 1969, after nearly 6 months of what could only be called battlefield apprenticeship, I was assigned to conduct a reconnaissance mission against the Lai KHE base. Getting in and out was a slow and painstaking process. After more than 2 weeks of crawling through the defenses, I had managed to reach only the 3rd layer of wire. On the way back out, with less than half a barrier still to cross, I was suddenly hit by enemy fire. The bullet struck my left thigh. It was not because I had been detected. The enemy had simply opened fire at random into the darkness, as they often did. By sheer bad luck, one of those stray rounds found its mark. Fueled by adrenaline, I kept moving and managed to clear the final stretch of wire before stopping. Only after reaching a patch of low shrubs some distance away did I finally pause to dress the wound. I wrapped the injury tightly with 2 bandages, yet blood continued to soak through the cloth. I was beginning to feel lightheaded, but I remained clear-headed enough to reach into my demolition pouch and pull out a lump of rock salt, about the size of a finger and hard as a stone. It was something we always carried with us. I put it in my mouth and sucked on it slowly to help fight off thirst while I recovered enough strength to continue moving. After that, I kept crawling and crawling and crawling. By the time I finally reached the edge of the forest, dawn was beginning to break. The pain was setting in now. Fatigue was catching up with me, and with every meter, my strength faded a little more. When I was healthy, my equipment had felt almost weightless. A demolition pouch carrying 20 guide markers, 4 American grenades, a single C4 demolition charge reserved for the worst-case scenario, when escape was no longer possible, and a K-54 pistol with 4 magazines. Under normal circumstances, I barely noticed the weight, but wounded and exhausted, every item seemed to grow heavier with each movement. But now, every piece of equipment felt unbearably heavy. Even so, I could not bring myself to abandon any of it. The gear was not just equipment, it was my means of survival. So I dragged it along with me, meter by meter, fighting against the pain and exhaustion. At some point, however, my strength finally gave out. The last thing I remember was trying to move forward. After that, everything went dark. I do not know when I lost consciousness. When I regained consciousness, I found myself lying in the Ben Cat Civilian Medical Station. I asked the nurses who had brought me there, but they did not know either. No one could tell me who had carried me out. That only deepened the mystery. From Lai Khe, one had to cross Highway 13 and then traverse a wide stretch of sparsely wooded open ground before reaching the Long Nguyen area. For a wounded man who had already collapsed from blood loss and exhaustion, it was a considerable distance. To this day, I still do not know who rescued me or how I was brought back alive. This passage has a strong memoir quality because the unanswered question, who carried me to safety, adds both mystery and emotion to the story. I still do not know how my comrades managed to get me back so quickly. Even now, when I think about it, it seems almost impossible. Perhaps that is one of the truths of war. War is not a place for glory or for showing off one's courage. It is a place where men risk and sometimes give their lives for one another. Without that bond between comrades, many of us would never have made it home. Without my comrades, there is no telling what would have happened to me. I spent nearly 3 weeks recovering. The wound had not fully healed, but the men came to bring me back to the unit anyway. Then again, the unit was always short of manpower. There was never a time when another pair of hands or another rifle was not needed. So as soon as I was able to move on my own, I rejoined the others and returned to the field. According to the assignment, I was tasked with leading King's squad across the Saigon River into the Cu Chi area, so that the new recruits could become familiar with the land of steel. Years earlier, An Nam Ngoc had done the same for me when I was still a newcomer to the battlefield. Now it was my turn to pass on that experience. The journey, however, was far from easy. Crossing the river and moving through unfamiliar terrain demanded patience, endurance, and constant vigilance. For the recruits, it was their first real taste of the hardships that came with operating in one of the most fiercely contested regions of the war. It was a difficult and exhausting trip, but an important step in turning inexperienced soldiers into seasoned fighters. The young recruits, most of them former students, were not strong swimmers and had little experience with rivers. The tidal currents made them especially uneasy. They crossed the Thi Ting River slowly and cautiously, and when we reached the much wider Saigon River, their nervousness caused them to make far more noise than they should have. Every splash seemed loud in the stillness of the night. Things did not improve once we reached the opposite bank. To get ashore, we had to wade through a stretch of deep mud, and the recruits struggled awkwardly with every step. They slipped, stumbled, and floundered about, trying to free their feet from the sucking mud. Watching them, I could not help but remember my own first days in the field, when everything seemed unfamiliar and twice as difficult as it really was. Fortunately, we had barely made it onto the riverbank when an enemy patrol boat appeared on the Saigon River. The timing could not have been any closer. Had the patrol arrived just a little earlier, while we were still struggling in the water and mud, the outcome might have been disastrous. As we like to say afterward, the mother fish and baby fish of the Saigon River would have enjoyed a feast from our remains. It was a grim joke, but one that reflected how narrowly we had escaped danger that night. After spending a week in Cu Chi familiarizing the recruits with the area and the unit's operating bases, we headed back to Long Nguyen. Crossing the Saigon River was only the beginning. Once we reached the far bank, we still had to run nearly 2 kilometers to get past the Ruchbop base and its surrounding security zone. By the time we cleared the area, every one of us was breathing hard. The recruits were exhausted from the river crossing, the mud, and the constant tension of moving through hostile territory. Even the veterans felt the strain. It was a reminder that on this battlefield, simply getting from one place to another could be as demanding as a combat mission. Crossing the Ticing River was much the same story. The young recruits had spent most of their lives with books and classrooms rather than rivers and jungles, so they tired quickly under the demands of the march. The constant swimming, wading through mud, carrying equipment, and moving under combat conditions drained their strength far faster than it did the veterans. Still, they persevered. 2 days after we returned to Long Nguyen, the reconnaissance team monitoring Highway 13 brought back a report. Along Highway 13, numerous convoys of tanks, armored personnel carriers, bulldozers, and GMC trucks carrying troops and supplies were moving back and forth. Some columns traveled north from Thu Tho Moat, passing through Ben Cat and continuing toward Lai Hung. The volume of traffic was noticeably heavier than usual, suggesting that the enemy was either reinforcing its positions or preparing for a major operation in the area. For men who had spent years watching and studying enemy movements, such activity rarely went unnoticed. But there were also convoys moving in the opposite direction, from Lai Hung back toward Ben Cat. At the same time, transport helicopters were ferrying troops and artillery from Lai Khe toward the Bo Bang area. Above them, pairs of armed helicopters, what we called Kalep, were flying the same route, providing escort and covering the movement below. The skies were busy, and the roads were crowded with military traffic. Taken together, these signs suggested that something significant was underway. Whether the enemy was redeploying forces, preparing a sweep operation, or shifting troops to another sector, we could not yet tell. But experience had taught us that such large-scale movements usually meant trouble was coming. The enemy dropped large quantities of psychological warfare leaflets. Some contained provocative images and photographs of nude women. Others were designed to undermine morale in more personal ways. There were even leaflets printed with photographs and information about certain North Vietnamese cadres, soldiers, and members of their families back home. It was clear that these were part of a broader psychological campaign intended to influence attitudes, sow doubt, and weaken the resolve of those fighting in the field. Day and night, psychological warfare aircraft, OV-10s and helicopters, circled overhead, broadcasting appeals for soldiers to surrender and join the Chu Hoi program. In the Ben Cat area, the enemy even set up loudspeakers on the ground to broadcast similar messages. Along with the calls to defect, they played sentimental songs about home, family, and loved ones left behind. The music drifted through the jungle for hours at a time, slow, melancholy, and haunting. It was all part of a carefully planned psychological campaign aimed at stirring homesickness, loneliness, and doubt among soldiers who had spent years far from home. During the week that our group was in Cu Chi, Thu and Tai were sent to the Bao Bang area to learn from a neighboring unit's experience in conducting ambushes with mine traps. The purpose was to exchange battlefield knowledge and study tactics that had proven effective against enemy patrols and convoy movements. For small units like ours, such opportunities were valuable. We had limited manpower and resources, so any new technique that could increase our effectiveness or improve our chances of survival was worth learning. When they returned, they brought back not only practical lessons, but also fresh ideas that might be adapted to our own operations. Back at our base, Anbei and several of the men recovered 2 unexploded bombs and salvaged the explosive material from them. Each bomb yielded enough explosive to produce nearly a dozen small directional mines. At our request, Logistics Unit 814 also supplied us with a quantity of detonators, safety fuses, and stick grenades. Then, by pure luck, Anthu's squad came across a 3rd unexploded bomb. With explosive material finally available again, we divided it into smaller charges for use in various types of mines. Since we had no scales in the field, we measured the explosive by volume instead of weight. Empty sardine cans served as our standard measure at first, allowing us to prepare charges of 2, 3, 4, or 5 canfuls. Later, when they became available, condensed milk cans replaced the sardine tins because they were more convenient and uniform in size. Nothing went to waste. In a unit where supplies were always scarce, every useful item had value, and every recovered resource could be turned into another weapon. Once our field rations were ready, a nickname we jokingly used for the newly prepared mines, Anbei sent Antu's squad back to the Bobang area, while my squad carried several of the devices across to Kuchi for field testing. The results exceeded our expectations. Antu's squad successfully struck a jeep carrying 3 pacification personnel and 5 local militia members, disabling the vehicle and inflicting casualties. Meanwhile, our squad ambushed a small group of 5 local security personnel and armed youth auxiliaries operating in the Kuchi area. For a small unit like ours, these actions confirmed that the mines were effective and that the effort spent recovering and repurposing explosive material had not been wasted. The success also boosted morale. After months of shortages and hardship, it was encouraging to know that we could still find ways to strike back despite our limited resources. For nearly a month, our 4 squads operated in 4 different directions. Working alongside neighboring units, we carried out operations across a wide area, from Long Nguyen, An Dien, Tân An, and Ben Cat, all the way to the outskirts of Thu Tho Mot. Constant movement became one of our greatest advantages. By avoiding fixed patterns and never staying in one place for long, we made it difficult for the enemy to predict our movements or concentrate forces against us. This mobility also helped us avoid direct confrontations with the Ranger units of the ARVN 5th Division, whose superior numbers and firepower could have posed a serious threat to a small force like ours. Just as importantly, the continuous operations gave us valuable experience. Each mission taught new lessons about reconnaissance, ambush tactics, hit-and-run attacks, and survival in the field. For the younger soldiers, it was an intensive education. For the veterans, it was another reminder that adaptability was often the key to staying alive. From late May to early July 1971, An Thu's sector remained extremely active. During that period, his squad conducted 5 separate operations against enemy positions. On 3 occasions, Squads 2 and 3 were brought in to reinforce attacks against ARVN outposts located near the Lai Khe and northern Ben Cat bases. In one assault on an outpost north of Ben Cat, the riflemen from King's squad managed to throw almost their entire allotment of demolition charges. King himself had already expended roughly half of his charges when he became trapped by a low, cage-style barbed wire obstacle and could advance no farther. Meanwhile, Luan, serving as the B-40 gunner, and Phuong from An Thu's squad both achieved successful hits against enemy armored vehicles and engaged several enemy groups during the fighting. The action was costly, however. Both An Thu and Ha were wounded. While An Thu remained with the unit, Ha's injuries required him to be evacuated to the rear for treatment. For the newer recruits, these battles provided harsh but valuable experience. They were beginning to learn that combat rarely unfolded according to plan, and that success often came at a price. From late May to early July 1971, An Thu's sector remained extremely active. During that period, his squad conducted 5 separate operations against enemy positions. On 3 occasions, Squads 2 and 3 were brought in to reinforce attacks against ARVN outposts located near the Lai Khe and northern Ben Cat bases. In one assault on an outpost north of Ben Cat, the riflemen from King's squad managed to throw almost their entire allotment of demolition charges. King himself had already expended roughly half of his charges when he became trapped by a low, cage-style barbed wire obstacle and could advance no farther. Meanwhile, Luan, serving as the B-40 gunner, and Phuong from An Thu Squad both achieved successful hits against enemy armored vehicles and engaged several enemy groups during the fighting. The action was costly, however. Both An Thu and Ha were wounded. While An Thu remained with the unit, Ha's injuries required him to be evacuated to the rear for treatment. For the newer recruits, these battles provided harsh but valuable experience. They were beginning to learn that combat rarely unfolded according to plan, and that success often came at a price. Along Highway 13 and on the roads leading into Ben Cat, the new recruits scored their first successes, using mines to damage armored vehicles and inflict casualties on enemy infantry. They were understandably excited. Keen and Lan, in particular, could not stop talking about the operations afterward. Their stories seemed to grow a little more dramatic each time they were told. Still, no one held it against them. Winning a first battle is something every soldier remembers, and a certain amount of pride comes naturally with it. We veterans simply listened and smiled. Experience had taught us that one successful action did not mean the war was won. There would be more hardships, more close calls, and more lessons ahead. The conflict was far from over. Out there, beyond the trees and the roads, the enemy was still waiting for us. In July, as the campaign came to an end, we submitted recommendations to higher headquarters for commendations recognizing both the unit's collective achievements and the individual contributions of several soldiers. Among those singled out for praise were three of the newer recruits, King, Luan, and Tai. The recognition meant a great deal to them. Only a few months earlier, they had arrived as inexperienced newcomers, still learning how to move through the jungle, cross rivers, and operate under combat conditions. Now they had already taken part in successful operations and proven themselves under fire. For the veterans, it was gratifying to see. The battlefield was a harsh teacher, but these young soldiers were learning quickly. Their commendations were not merely rewards for courage. They were signs that they were becoming capable and dependable members of the unit. At Dongdu, the U.S. 25th Infantry Division, known as the Tropic Lightning Division, officially announced its withdrawal in March 1971. In reality, however, large numbers of American troops could still be seen in the area. Elsewhere, the situation appeared different. At several bases, the American presence had noticeably decreased, with the RVN forces increasingly taking over positions and responsibilities once held by U.S. units. We had also begun noticing another development. As early as late 1970, we observed main force units of the southern battlefield moving toward lower regions closer to populated areas. The sight immediately sparked speculation among us. The men exchanged theories and hopeful predictions, trying to guess what these troop movements might mean. Could a larger offensive be coming? Was a major change in the war approaching? No one knew for certain, but the signs were enough to lift spirits and fuel endless discussions around our campsites. Another major offensive must be coming. That was the conclusion many of us reached, and we waited eagerly for what might happen next. But the weeks passed, and instead of a large-scale offensive, we saw the enemy launch more pacification campaigns, population control operations, and search and destroy missions. Artillery and airstrikes continued to pound the countryside with relentless intensity. As 1971 unfolded, however, there were encouraging signs elsewhere. In the Cu-chi districts of An Nyon Te, Phu Mi Hung, and Trung Lep Thuong, local guerrilla forces succeeded in eliminating several notorious informants, pacification personnel, and enemy collaborators. The guerrillas of An Nyon Te went even further, overrunning a small outpost and destroying an enemy platoon. In northern Cu-chi, friendly forces destroyed a number of tanks, armored vehicles, and bulldozers while successfully disrupting several enemy sweep operations. Individually, these victories were relatively small, yet taken together, they demonstrated that the enemy's control was far from complete. Each successful action imposed costs, boosted morale, and gradually influenced the situation on the battlefield. The changes were subtle, but they were becoming increasingly noticeable. By the middle of 1971, despite the continuing intensity of the war, there were signs of recovery across the battlefield. In areas such as Cu Chi, Bao Bang, the outskirts of Thu Do Mot, and Bang Kat, many local guerrilla units had been rebuilt and were gradually returning to active operations. At the same time, regional main force units increased their activities, carrying out a series of attacks and ambushes against enemy forces along Highway 13 and other key routes. Pressure on enemy positions grew in areas such as Bao Bang, Changlon, Daoting, and Dongdu. For those of us operating in small units deep in the field, these developments were encouraging. After years of heavy fighting, losses, and constant enemy operations, it seemed that friendly forces were slowly regaining strength and expanding their presence once again. The war remained difficult and dangerous, but there was a growing sense that the battlefield was beginning to change. To find out what was really happening on the enemy side, some of us proposed launching an attack in early April 1971. Let us hit them once and see how they react, we argued. But An Bai disagreed. He warned that such an action might amount to what the Vietnamese call Lai Ong Toyo Bui Nai, roughly equivalent to revealing your own hiding place to the enemy. In other words, an unnecessary attack could alert the enemy to our presence, expose our operating area, and invite a response far more costly than any information we might gain. His reasoning was hard to argue with, so we put the idea aside and waited. Sometimes, on a battlefield, restraint required as much discipline as action. While we were still waiting for orders from higher headquarters, news began reaching us from local civilians working in the rubber plantations around Daoting. Their message was simple but alarming. The enemy is coming back in large numbers. The reports came from people who spent their days moving through the plantations and surrounding countryside. They paid close attention to military activity because their own safety often depended on it. According to them, troop movements were increasing, military vehicles were appearing more frequently, and there were signs that substantial enemy forces were returning to the area. The information immediately caught our attention. Whether the reports indicated a major operation or merely a temporary redeployment, one thing was clear. Something significant was unfolding, and we needed to be ready. An Bai immediately sent reconnaissance teams to verify the reports. When they returned, their findings confirmed what the civilians had been saying. The enemy was indeed moving troops on a large scale. Every day, aircraft of various types could be seen transporting troops, conducting patrols, and carrying out intensive reconnaissance missions. The skies seemed busier than usual, with aircraft constantly searching, observing, and probing the area. On the Saigon River, large numbers of patrol boats had appeared, maintaining a far heavier presence than before. Most striking of all was the unusual increase in enemy forces operating outside their fixed bases. The buildup was too significant to be routine. Something was clearly underway, and the scale of the preparation suggested that a major operation might be approaching. To deal with the changing situation, An Bai gathered the squad leaders and briefed us on the new combat deployment orders. The atmosphere immediately became more serious. The reports from civilians, the reconnaissance findings, and the increasing enemy activity all pointed in the same direction. Whatever was coming, we would soon be involved in it. And so we entered the 1971 campaign season. One morning in the middle of March 1971, An Bai summoned me to his bunker and assigned my squad a special mission. We were to provide security for a man known only as An Ba during an important trip. That was all the information we were given. In our line of work, it was not unusual. Questions were kept to a minimum, and people often knew only what they needed to know. Even so, it was clear from An Bai's manner that this was no ordinary assignment. I had been assigned to courier and security missions like this many times before, so the task itself was nothing new. This time, however, there was one important difference. An Bai wanted to travel during daylight hours. That immediately caught my attention. In our area of operations, movement was normally conducted at night whenever possible. Daytime travel exposed us to enemy aircraft, patrols, observation posts, and countless other dangers. We all understood the risks, yet Anba insisted that the mission was urgent and that time could not be wasted. Dangerous or not, the order had been given. And in wartime, an order was an order. So we made our preparations and set out, fully aware that the journey ahead would be far more hazardous than usual. We called him Anba, but in truth he was already an elderly man by our standards. His hair was completely white. Thin, almost to the point of frailty, he walked with a slight limp. Yet once we entered the forest, he moved with surprising speed, slipping through the jungle trails as if he had spent a lifetime doing so. There was nothing slow or hesitant about him. Accompanying Anba were 2 security escorts from the south. Both appeared alert, experienced, and remarkably agile. Their presence suggested that Anba was an important person, although none of us asked questions. In those days, it was often better not to know more than necessary. Our job was simple: get him safely to his destination and bring everyone back alive. According to Engba's plan, our small party moved in a staggered formation. Tai carrying the B-40 launcher and I took the lead. Engba and the first bodyguard followed in the center, while Thao and the second bodyguard brought up the rear. Each element maintained a distance of roughly 10 to 20 meters from the next. Whenever we approached a junction, a logging track, or an opening through the rubber plantations, Tai's responsibility was to find a concealed position and provide overwatch while the rest of us crossed. As for me, I would move ahead first to scout the route. The lead man always carried the greatest risk. If enemy troops appeared unexpectedly, he would be the first to encounter them and the first to react, giving those behind him a chance to escape or seek cover. Only after the route appeared clear would the others cross in sequence. First the lead bodyguard, then Anba, followed by the second bodyguard and Thao. Tai crossed last, after everyone else had safely made it through. It was a simple arrangement, but one designed to maximize security while moving through territory where danger could appear without warning. Following Anba's directions, we wound our way through forests, plantations, and back trails for 3 days and 3 nights. There was no proper sleep. Anba allowed us to stop only for brief rest breaks and meals before pressing on again. The pace was relentless. At last, just as dawn was breaking, we arrived in the Fuloi area, the same place I had heard about years earlier in the north through the famous poem Hatred That Will Never Fade Through Countless Lifetimes. Now, however, my attention was drawn to something more immediate. The enemy maintained a powerful artillery position there, one that was well known for its ability to reach deep into the surrounding region. While Anba attended to his business, we seized the opportunity to sleep. After 3 days and nights of continuous movement, exhaustion overcame us almost instantly. But the rest was brief. By midday, Anba had completed his work, and we were ordered to begin the return journey to Bangkat without delay. There was no time to linger. As always, the mission came first. Maintaining the same pace and security formation as on the outward journey, we finally made our way back to base. By the time we arrived, it was already well past midnight. We were exhausted, yet Anba did not stop to rest. Almost immediately after reaching the base, he was met by another party and departed again without delay. Only later did Anba tell us who he really was. Anba was in fact Omtham Thuong, one of the veteran commanders of the military sub-region. That revelation explained a great deal. The mission had clearly been more important than we had realized. As for us, the journey had drained every ounce of strength we possessed. Days of continuous movement, constant vigilance, and the strain of operating in hostile territory had left our bodies aching and our minds exhausted. Yet Anba and his bodyguards simply continued on their way. Watching that level of endurance was astonishing. It reminded us that physical strength alone could never explain such stamina. What carried people through hardships like that was determination, the extraordinary strength of human will. In early April 1971, our unit received a delegation of 5 officers from the military subregion. Each officer arrived with 2 security escorts. A meeting was immediately convened in Anbai's bunker. Although Amtu and I were the deputy leaders of the unit, our responsibility on that occasion was security. We remained outside, maintaining watch while the meeting took place. Inside the bunker, 8 men gathered around a map spread across the floor. The space was already small, and with so many people inside, it felt crowded. To prevent any light from escaping, we carefully sealed the entrance. A North Vietnamese poncho was hung across the bunker opening, and additional leafy branches were placed over it to conceal any glow that might be visible from outside. The precautions may have seemed excessive, but they were necessary. In our area, even a tiny flash of light at night could attract unwanted attention from enemy patrols, aircraft, or informants. When senior officers gathered for an important meeting, security became everyone's highest priority. Throughout the night, the meeting continued beneath the dim light of 3 flashlights, which were used in turn to illuminate the map spread across the bunker floor. The commanders discussed their plans in low voices while studying the terrain and positions marked before them. The meeting was chaired by a man everyone addressed as An Chin. He was thin, lean, and somewhat bony in appearance, speaking with a southern accent. To me, he looked like a veteran of many years, perhaps one of the cadres who had regrouped to the north after the First Indochina War and later returned to the south. He must have been well over 50 years old. The other commanders addressed one another by familiar names, such as Hai, Ba, Tu, Chin, Bai, and Ut. Whether these were nicknames, code names, or simply the customary way they identified one another, I could not tell. In any case, I never learned their real names. For soldiers like us, that was perfectly normal. We were there to provide security, not to know the identities of senior leaders or the details of their discussions. The meeting was temporarily halted as dawn began to break, interrupted by the distant sound of helicopter engines overhead. Not long after, artillery from Lai Khe started shelling the Long Nguyen area. The bunker became more tense, the atmosphere shifting instantly from discussion to alertness. Ang Bei came over to where I was standing and arranged for the bunker to be handed over to the visiting cadres so they could rest. We moved aside and quickly ate what we could. The meal was simple: rice porridge cooked from military rice, wild leaves collected from the forest, and canned sardines brought by the visiting delegation from Cambodia. Under normal circumstances, it would have been nothing special. But after nights of movement, lack of sleep, and constant tension, that modest meal tasted incredibly good. In moments like that, even the simplest food could feel like a rare comfort. We had just drifted into a light sleep on our hammocks when Anhmbay called us up again to continue our duties. By midday, the meeting among the senior cadres had finally concluded. What struck me at the time was how calmly they discussed matters that, for us, on the ground, directly involved life and death. The decisions were distributed in a very matter-of-fact way. Anchin would say things like, "Hai will handle this sector," or "U takes responsibility for that area." Then instructions followed. "Hai, take care of the river patrol boats," or "Bai, let your men operate in this zone," and reminders such as B-40 units must not be careless with enemy armor, and do not allow enemy reconnaissance teams to penetrate further. It was all said in a straightforward, almost casual tone. Yet behind each sentence was a chain of operations that could decide the fate of many soldiers. At the time, I could not help but feel a sense of surprise at how such heavy responsibility could be assigned so simply. But that, I slowly came to understand, was how wartime command worked: clear, direct, and without unnecessary words. By dusk, the visiting cadres began leaving our unit. They split into different directions, each small group moving off under cover of the fading light. We were completely exhausted. I and N2 had barely intended to lie down and catch some sleep when Anbei again summoned us to the bunker for a quick discussion on combat deployment. So once more, we stayed awake and worked through the possible plans of engagement. Anyone who has ever faced combat knows that feeling right before an operation begins. It is impossible to forget. No matter how experienced a soldier is, it is never completely without fear or tension. Movements become more careful, thoughts more focused, and the body naturally reacts to danger. Some men, especially those new to the battlefield, could barely control their nerves. I had seen cases where soldiers became so overwhelmed at the edge of enemy wire that they lost control of themselves. That was simply the reality of facing death up close. Yet when an operation was assigned, there was no option but to proceed. Preparation had to be made, plans had to be agreed upon, and the unit had to move forward with whatever strength remained. That was the nature of our duty, to continue fighting and gradually wear down the enemy, no matter how difficult the circumstances. Waiting for the right moment. Throughout April 1971, the section of Highway 13 under our responsibility, stretching over 10 kilometers, was under an atmosphere that felt unusually tense and volatile. Every day began the same way. From early morning, groups of 7 to 8 UH-1 helicopters continuously flew in, transporting troops. CH-47 Chinook helicopters followed, lifting and moving artillery pieces, jeeps, and equipment to various unknown destinations. At the same time, artillery positions from Lai He, Tan Phu Trung, Dong Zu, and Phu Loi fired almost continuously. Even the sound of artillery preparation bursts alone was enough to make one uneasy. It was clear that a large-scale military activity was underway. The Long Nguyen forest, which had been slowly recovering, once again became a target of intense bombardment. In such conditions, even the slightest sign of activity, what we used to call a cough from the Viet Cong, could trigger immediate and overwhelming retaliation. Bombs, shells, and airstrikes would quickly follow, leaving vast areas stripped bare with nothing left able to survive. It was a harsh reminder of how fragile any temporary calm could be in a war zone. In the mornings, enemy troop convoys would move along Highway 13 from Tu Dau Mort, heading up toward Bao Bang. What was unusual was the formation. There were no reconnaissance vehicles leading the column and no apparent mine-clearing elements in front. The vehicles simply followed one another in a steady stream. By afternoon, those same convoys often appeared to be returning in the opposite direction, toward Bengkat or Lai He. On some days, the movement was lighter, sometimes only a single armored vehicle accompanied by 3 or 4 GMC trucks covered with tarpaulins, heading back toward Thu Dau Mot. From our observation, we suspected that these vehicles were likely transporting casualties from engagements in the Tao O Hun Quan area. It was difficult to confirm from a distance, but the pattern suggested the aftermath of heavy fighting. In the field, we learned to read such movements carefully. Even without direct contact, logistics and transport often revealed more about the situation than official reports ever could. In our experience, whenever American forces conducted an operation, they would typically precede it with heavy preparatory firepower, artillery strikes, air bombardments, and coordinated fire support designed to clear and isolate the landing or advance area. It created a wide protective belt of explosive coverage before ground troops moved in. The ARVN units often followed similar tactics, adopting the American style of search and destroy operations, with heavy use of artillery and air support to suppress suspected enemy positions before advancing. However, there was a pattern we observed over time. If their forces encountered mines or met with organized resistance, both American and ARVN units tended to slow down, regroup, or withdraw temporarily to avoid further losses and reassess the situation. Among them, the Ranger units were often regarded as more aggressive and persistent in their assaults, continuing to press forward even in difficult conditions. From our perspective on the ground, These differences in behavior were clearly noticeable during engagements and shaped the way each operation unfolded. From the way the enemy was moving, we judged that they were likely Ranger units of the ARVN 5th Division. Their formation and behavior suggested a certain confidence, even aggressiveness. At times, they appeared to expose what seemed like obvious tactical weaknesses, gaps that any cautious commander would normally avoid exploiting. This created a dilemma for anyone observing them. A cautious commander might hesitate, suspecting a trap, but a more aggressive approach could lead straight into an ambush. We could not rule out the possibility that the enemy was deliberately trying to lure us into action, using bait formations or feigned vulnerabilities to draw out attacks. In the field, such uncertainty was common. Nothing could be taken at face value, and every apparent opportunity had to be weighed against the possibility of deception. It was a constant psychological struggle as much as a tactical one. Every afternoon, it was the same scene. The GMC convoys returning along the road would halt in a long line at the roadside. Soldiers would jump down from the vehicles, breaking formation almost immediately. There was little sense of discipline in their movements. They called out to one another loudly, moving in scattered groups without clear organization. No proper perimeter security was established. Instead, everyone seemed absorbed in personal routines. Some walked off to relieve themselves right along the roadside. Others lit cigarettes and smoked casually. A group gathered around a soldier playing music on a cassette player, while another opened ration tins to eat and drink. Those who were not engaged in any activity simply sat on the ground, leaning on their weapons in a tired, indifferent posture. From our observation, it was a routine stop rather than a combat-ready halt. The lack of alertness was noticeable, especially in a war zone where ambushes could happen at any time. For about 10 days, Highway 13 remained unusually quiet. Along the 10-kilometer stretch, there was no gunfire, no direct clashes, only the constant movement of enemy forces. Above, Calep helicopters continued to circle and patrol the area, acting as aerial cover for the ground convoys moving below. From a tactical perspective, it was a tense kind of calm. On one hand, the apparent lack of fighting and the exposed movement of troops might have tempted any commander looking for an opportunity to strike. A well-prepared ambush could have inflicted damage and yielded results. On the other hand, the situation also carried significant risk. The absence of engagement could itself be a sign of a prepared defensive posture. Any sudden attack on the highway risked triggering a rapid and overwhelming response, potentially drawing the attacking force into a larger, coordinated enemy trap. For small units operating in the area, this was the constant dilemma: when to act and when restraint was the wiser choice. At the Bingkat Junction area, enemy troops appeared more disciplined than those we had observed further along Highway 13. After disembarking from helicopters, they quickly formed combat formations and advanced in small, cautious groups with clear tactical organization. When they reached the edge of the forest, they would fire into suspected positions, probing for resistance, but rarely pushed deeper inside. This pattern repeated almost every day. They would deploy in the morning, operate in the field for a limited time, and then withdraw by afternoon. Some foot patrols moved along Highway 13, but even these typically advanced only 4 to 5 kilometers before stopping to wait along the roadside for transport vehicles to pick them up, either returning to Bang Kat or heading back toward Lai Khe. The cycle was consistent and predictable. Meanwhile, further north toward Bo Bang, artillery and airstrikes continued almost without pause, with explosions echoing throughout the day and night. It created a stark contrast between the heavily bombarded areas and the more controlled routine movements along the highway. What struck us as even more unusual was what we observed at the helicopter landing zones. There was little to no visible safety inspection or perimeter checking. When it came time to extract, soldiers from different directions simply converged on the pickup zones. There was no clear effort to establish layered security or maintain a tight defensive cordon around the landing areas. It was noticeably different from what we had seen in earlier years, such as around 1969. The impression we got was that speed had become the priority. The troops seemed focused on getting in and out quickly rather than holding a disciplined defensive posture during the pickup phase. From our perspective on the ground, this change in behavior stood out clearly. In a war zone, especially during extraction, any reduction in caution could signal either overconfidence or fatigue from prolonged operations. Alongside the regular divisions and task forces, small reconnaissance and commando teams were also being deployed into the battlefield. These units moved quietly, conducting deep searches and probing operations inside the forested areas. Some of the commando groups penetrated quite far into the jungle. There was, however, a noticeable difference compared to earlier years, such as 1969. Back then, American reconnaissance teams were typically smaller, around 10 to 15 men, but they were often supported by heavy helicopter firepower and close aerial cover during operations. By 1971, the ARVN reconnaissance groups were larger, sometimes 20 to 25 men, but they no longer appeared to have the same level of dedicated aerial support. We also observed a change in discipline and fieldcraft. In previous operations, these units usually took great care to conceal their presence and erase traces of movement. This time, however, they seemed less meticulous. We found discarded American ration packaging, RVN food supplies, makeshift sleeping positions hastily constructed from both fresh and dry jungle foliage, and shallow, poorly concealed individual fighting positions that had been quickly abandoned or covered up. These signs suggested hurried movement and a less methodical approach than we had seen before. After a full week of shadowing enemy movements, the reconnaissance teams returned to base and delivered their report. Bay listened carefully without interrupting. When they finished, he spoke in a calm but firm tone. Everyone must maintain maximum vigilance. They haven't fully deployed into the forest yet. This is bait. They are trying to lure us into reacting. In a few days, they will move in. His assessment immediately changed the atmosphere in the bunker. What had looked like routine movement on Highway 13 now took on a different meaning. The apparent gaps, the relaxed behavior of troops, and the repeated in and out patterns could all be part of a deliberate setup. For us, it was a reminder that in this kind of warfare, patience and caution were just as important as striking power. If the enemy was indeed preparing a trap, then rushing in too early could turn advantage into loss in an instant. Our unit was ordered to stay completely still and maintain position. There was no option but to obey. The instruction was simple: wait. And waiting in a situation like this was never easy. As the days dragged on, impatience began to build. The longer nothing happened, the easier it became for doubt or overconfidence to creep in. In such conditions, even a small misjudgment could turn a favorable situation into a disadvantage. Meanwhile, outside our positions, the enemy continued its provocations, movement, patrols, and psychological pressure designed to provoke a reaction. It became a silent confrontation of endurance rather than firepower, a test of nerves. A contest to see who would break first, Bay repeatedly reminded us to stay calm and not fall into the enemy's design. Stay patient, he said. We cannot fall into their trap. And so we waited, not because it was easy, but because it was necessary. While we were still under orders to hold position and await further instructions, we continued sending out reconnaissance elements to monitor enemy activity. From a distance, we observed enemy movements, but maintained strict silence and did not engage. However, other friendly units in the region did not remain inactive. North of Lai Hung, a separate unit reportedly set up an ambush against an enemy convoy. In response, the enemy quickly deployed tanks and armored vehicles from Lai He as reinforcement. Along the stretch between Ben Cat and Thu Do Mot, another unit also conducted an ambush operation and succeeded in disabling several GMC troop carriers. These actions indicated that despite the overall operational pause in our sector, combat activity continued elsewhere along Highway Tracy. The battlefield remained dynamic, with engagements occurring in different pockets depending on opportunity and initiative. But enemy helicopter gunships also arrived almost immediately, with artillery from Phu Loit providing direct fire support. At the very stretch of road we were observing, another unit, unidentified to us at the time, had laid mines and managed to overturn a GMC truck full of soldiers. What followed was sudden and chaotic. Enemy forces seemed to pour in from multiple directions, as if disturbed from a nest. Helicopters circled overhead, artillery fire intensified, and ground troops pushed rapidly toward the forest edge. The situation escalated so quickly that we had no time to analyze it further. We were forced to withdraw under pressure, moving fast to avoid being pinned down. In moments like that, observation turned into survival first. Everything else had to wait until we were safely out of contact. One morning at the end of April, Anbei called all the squad leaders into the bunker. He looked at us and said, "You're probably getting impatient, aren't you? I am too. But do you even know who we are up against? The Ranger units of the ARVN 5th Division. These are extremely aggressive and unpredictable forces. We have to study them carefully before we can deal with them." He then briefed us in detail about their characteristics, combat strength, and operational methods. Listening to him, we began to understand that rushing in blindly would be dangerous. From that point on, the question shifted to tactics. How exactly should we fight them? We gathered and discussed various possibilities. At first, some suggested capturing a few enemy soldiers for intelligence purposes, but Anbei rejected the idea, warning that it could expose our position and bring unwanted attention. We then proposed setting mines at different distances to create layered defenses around our base. However, he was concerned that enemy artillery might accidentally detonate our own devices, causing unnecessary losses. That plan was also set aside. One idea after another was considered, and one after another was rejected. Yet Anbei remained calm, almost as if unconcerned by our growing frustration. Each day he continued moving from bunker to bunker, encouraging the men and maintaining morale. By then, we were becoming increasingly restless. 2 days before the operation, he finally gathered us again and issued the combat orders. He told us, "There are many units operating around us. Focus only on doing your job well. Assess your own strength properly and preserve your force." After hearing the deployment plan and assigned tasks, both Antu and I exchanged glances. With the density of enemy forces in the area, we could not help but feel that this operation would be extremely difficult to return from. We just smiled at each other, without saying much. In situations like that, words were often unnecessary. That night, as we looked at each other in silence, we all understood one thing clearly. Whatever lay ahead, it would not be easy. And the real story was only just beginning. In the next part, we will reveal how the Viet Cong Special Forces set their traps and ambushes in ways the enemy could never easily predict. If you found this story interesting, please consider liking the video, subscribing to the channel, and sharing it with others who are interested in Vietnam War memoirs. Your support helps us continue bringing these historical accounts to life. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next part.